Although a highly regarded sports agent by both players and GMs, it is indisputable that some negotiations and contracts don't always go as projected. So my question to you is, throughout your many years of experience, which player negotiations were the most frustrating and challenging, and why?
I would say where we were unsuccessful initially, eventually we were successful, was in relation to Mike Pekka, who played for the Buffalo Sabres. And this is going back a number of years. Michael's retired now. But when he was playing for the Sabres, they came off a Stanley Cup run, and they eventually lost to Dallas in the final. But he was instrumental, very, very valuable team member. We negotiated with management. At the end of the day, we simply couldn't come to a deal. I mean, in good faith, we had submissions from both ends that we worked at it, but we couldn't come to a deal. At that time, the team was owned by the Regis family. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Regis family, but the Regis family was very successful in cable. Adelphia Cable was their company. And eventually, both the patriarch of the family and his son went to jail. And the son is still in jail, and the father was released from jail because he was ill. So that's the ownership group that I was dealing with. And they took a position that, given that we couldn't come to an agreement, that they basically said, if you want to play in the National Hockey League, you're going to play for this salary or you're not going to play at all. We got to that point, we had said, well, look, if this hasn't worked, I'd like you to give some consideration to trading for competitive value that you can get for them. I mean, it's not that we've attempted to distort this process. You've even said as management that we have a position that is valid. It's just that we don't want to pay it. And quite frankly, we're not going to pay it because we don't have to. And quite frankly, our control is we'll keep them out of the game. So at that point in time, we asked for a trade. We didn't ask for this initially. We went through the whole negotiation process. And we were able to have Michael play for Team Canada at the Spengler Cup and then play in the World Championship. So in effect, he lost the year. He lost the year because basically they said, if you don't come to task, if you don't succumb to what we're telling you to do, you're not going to play. Now that hasn't happened really in my career. I haven't got to a point where that's happened. At the end of the year, Buffalo recognized that they weren't going to prevail, nor were we, so they traded him to the New York Islanders, and we were able to negotiate a contract with the New York Islanders that in effect subsidized Michael for the lost year. And in addition, in that year, he won a Major League award playing for the New York Islanders. He won the Selke Trophy. So in effect, what we were pitching to them was that he was that good, he was that valuable. He went to the Islanders and won a Major League award, but he had to live throughout that year of not playing. And that's really the only time that that's happened to me in my career in 36 years, that we got to scorched earth, if you will. But I always say at the end of the day, the people who manifested that are in jail, and I'm not.
So my question is, has your reputation as a tough negotiator ever affected the efficiency of reaching an agreement due to the opposite side's skepticism of you? Sorry.
We represent 130 players in the National Hockey League, so it's sufficiently small in our industry that managers will talk with each other. But what we do, we strike a presence in the National Hockey League to the extent that, as Ralph indicated, when we come to a negotiation, we're very, very well prepared. Secondly, we're not in a position where we come in with a number that would cause anybody to say, you're on another planet. It may be high, but it's within the range of the other side recognizing he's that good, we want him, they are setting a standard, but it's not something that we can't live with. We may not want to pay it, and we may have a disagreement, and we're going to have to put a lot more work into this. But we do have a reputation to the extent that we're not attempting to distort a situation for our own benefit or for our own presence, because the other side recognizes we've been at this for 36 years and that we have a very, very large clientele. So in effect, if we can get them to the table on that basis, we've got a pretty good chance. Now, there are occasions where it works the other way too, where the other side will recognize that we have a player and we don't have the leverage. So in terms of how you conduct yourself, if you're fair at the end of the day, when we run into a situation where I'm representing Ralph, who's at the end of his career, and I'm maybe going to squeeze out one more year, they're not going to stick it to me either, because it's a long, winding road. So in many respects, what people in our industry have to recognize that if your advocate, if your agent is attempting to make a place for himself in the industry or to get some notoriety, but trying to hit the ball out of the park on a negotiation, then it's going to come back to haunt you. And in terms of how you conduct yourself too, as far as the media is concerned, that's very important. So the club, from their perspective, they're suggesting a position to the fan base. We're attempting to do the best we can. We want the player back, but we're attempting to be fair. Now, if I were to run to the media and saying that Ralph is completely unfair, he's unethical, and I'm getting into a catfight, then that's going to come back to haunt me down the line, down the road. But some agents will do that.
So in the article entitled Ethical Considerations in Negotiation by Sports Agents, the reader is given information on the career of a sports agent. In the article, it specifically emphasizes the concept of conflict of interest that a sports agent may experience. This occurs when an agent represents more than one athlete on a team. Has there been a time within your career where you were exposed to this type of conflict of interest?
It's a very interesting question, and I want to preface this by saying that for players that choose lawyers to represent them, Ralph and I are both bound by the Law Society of Upper Canada, and there are rules and regulations that govern the way we practice law. And one of the things that we can't get into are conflict situations. Now, in terms of representing several players on a team, again, this is where it defines itself. There are players in different positions. So a forward or a defenseman may not be in a position whereby there's a conflict because it's a totally different set of circumstances. Now, if I'm representing two center icemen, again, they may play different ways. There's different roles on the team. But at the end of the day, we will always say, we're representing John and George and Harry on this team. It is a cap scenario. The team is entitled to spend $71.4 million, and it's a matter of how they're going to distribute this. We will say to the players, we're representing the three of you, but understand, on the basis of precedent and what the comparables are in the industry, we have to operate on the basis of comparables and precedent. So you may have 4 years into the league, Ralph may have 2 years into the league, and somebody else might be totally unrestricted. So I would say to the three of you, the person who's unrestricted will probably make more money than all of you because he's in a more favorable position under the CBA. And for the other two people, I would say, I can't take the same kind of position for you because you've got 2 years in the league as opposed to somebody who has 4. So it isn't avoiding the conflict issue, but there are so few circumstances where people will size up competitively and equally.
From your perspective, what can be done to improve the number of female sports agents who act either independently or work in agencies like yours? Additionally, do you have any advice for me, a young woman who wants to enter this industry one day?
People think that within my industry that the only aspect of what we do is representing players, and yet our business is so varied, it's so substantial. For example, let's take the Toronto Maple Leafs, for example. The New York Yankees. The New York Yankees has a woman that negotiates all of their arbitration cases and has done so for many, many years. In the hierarchy at Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment, there are professional people, whether they have MBAs or whether they have law degrees, that are involved in licensing or marketing. They may not be representing players, but they have very senior positions in relation to our industry, just for example, in different endeavors. What I do invariably involves like being at the locker room level and being in a position of being in rinks all over the world and watching 15-year-olds play. And I guess from history, I haven't really had anybody who's come to me. It's difficult enough to find men who want to do what I do. That's another aspect of what we do, in that many people think that, well, people just arrive on our door and say, I'd like you to represent me. And they're negotiating a major contract. But in terms of what we do, we would, for example, if we knew the best players in the world at the age of 15 in the world, we will know who they are. So that will mean going to the Czech Republic, the Slovak Republic, Slovenia, Finland, Sweden, Russia, the United States, Canada, any hockey playing jurisdiction in the world. It's tough enough to tell anybody, now follow me for a week, and then come home, and then we're off again for another week. It's tough enough to find men who want to do that. So in terms of, I really haven't come across a woman who loves the game that much where they want to engage and follow what I do that's necessary to be successful. But having said that, there are senior females in very senior positions within the National Hockey League, both at the National Hockey League office in New York. There are senior women at the National Hockey League Players Association. Maria Dennis is a colleague of mine, a labor lawyer with the NHLPA. So they're involved in our industry, but not necessarily being an agent in terms of what I do. So I think, I don't think there's any mitigating factors that would suggest to anybody that you couldn't be successful in our industry. It would just depend on what you actually want to do.
So according to a primetime sports management conference that you participated in, someone asked you to compare the major differences between a sports agency and a law firm in terms of the range of provided services. In one of your answers, you suggested that there is a misconception that sporting agencies spend a lot of their time on contract negotiations. You answered this misconception by indicating that you spend less than 5% of your time on contract negotiations. So my question to you is, can you please describe what the other 95% is primarily spent on? As well, are there any other misconceptions related to the work of sporting agents that are important to address?
Well, I think it's easy in terms of all the professional issues. So let me respond from a purely professional point of view. We would be involved, for example, with insurance issues relative to a player perhaps being hurt. So disability insurance is one of the major professional issues that we deal with. Taxation issues is another issue. So depending on what jurisdiction you're playing in, how do we cope and how do we deal with all taxation issues? How are we dealing with managing your money? So bringing investment people to the table so that we can counsel and advise you in relation to those particular issues. Marketing issues. So for example, if you're a great player and we have an opportunity of bringing, for example, the Toronto Dominion Bank, and they're prepared to endorse you, then how do we go about negotiating endorsement contracts? Those are just some of the professional accounting issues. Those are just some of the professional issues that take up our time. And the more successful you are, then obviously it takes up more of our time. In addition to that, there's a development process in terms of representing a player. And it's all too seldom where a great player will arrive on your doorstep and say, well, I understand that you're a good lawyer and you're enthusiastic, but I don't really know you. So in our industry, you have to get to know that family and you have to get to know that player. And invariably, if the player is that good, as I said earlier on, you'll know about it when he's 15 years old or maybe sooner. So at that point in time, you have to spend a great deal of time with that player and the family so that they understand the sequence of events. In other words, what are the decisions they have to make at the amateur level? How do they prepare for the draft? What kind of assistance do they need in order to be as successful as they can be in a National Hockey League draft? And that development process, to give you an indication in terms of having patience, It isn't like a law firm where the client comes in and said, could you incorporate a company for me and set me up so that I can do business? We would be involved with a great player at the age of 15. Well, for example, next year, in next year's draft, we represent a player by the name of Rasmus Dahlin from Sweden. And I'm fairly certain he'll be number 1 overall. He's that good. He's playing in the Swedish Elite League against men now at 16 years of age. We were involved on his behalf at 15. Now, he won't sign a contract until he's 18. We hope that he plays at 18, but maybe he'll play at 19. So that's 4 years into a file. 4 years into a file before you even issue a fee to that player. And under our CBA and a cap system, entry-level players are somewhat, I wouldn't say penalized, but they bear the brunt of a cap system whereby for 3 years they're capped in terms of what they can make. And really, for the fees that we bill on an entry-level contract, we more or less just tread water. It just covers our time. So the 4 years before he signs and the 3 years of an entry-level contract, we're into that file for 7 years. Now, if I said to Ralph that he was going to act for a company being a Bay Street lawyer with a very large law firm, and if I told him that he'd only really get to bill that client in 7 years' time, the senior partners would throw he out the office and throw me out the office for even bringing that into consideration. So you have time in that period of time of monitoring the player's success, helping him make decisions, and all the professional issues. So that's where 95% of the time goes.
In a paper by Balsam titled Free My Agent, Legal Implications of Professional Athletes' Self-Representation, it has been noted that there is a rising number of professional athletes that are representing themselves in player contract negotiations. Self-negotiation dates back to the 1980s, but the most notable case is Seattle Seahawks' Russell Okung declaring to free his agent. He educated himself on the market value and hired a lawyer for contract expertise and went on to sign with the Broncos, saving him approximately $1.8 million in agent fees. In Forbes, it has been stated that Okung believes that there is a discrepancy between the attention agents give to their clients versus the attention that client deserves, emphasizing that an unfocused agent is a useless agent. With Newport Sports Management, Inc. representing over 130 active players, how do you allocate the appropriate amount of time for each player without contributing to the growing concern that agents are handling too many clients?
Well, one thing I can tell you about our clientele is they are very demanding. In many respects, there's a sense of entitlement for very gifted players at a very early age. And they expect results, and more than that, they demand results. So I can't take this burden lightly to the extent that if I'm not performing, I'm out of business. So the players that are clients today are sophisticated enough, they receive a good deal of advice from the National Hockey League Players Association. They're well informed, and yet they need somebody really to be a buffer between the team and themselves. Because not only in relation to negotiating a contract, and I want to separate that aspect too, because that player that you referred to on Seattle, in essence, is saying, well, I want to pay you to negotiate a contract, but what is he doing from that day on? So that's suggestive of the fact that there's not going to be any issues in terms of medical issues, for example. What happens if he's hurt? What happens, for example, if the team says you're prepared to, you should play, and he has a doctor who says you shouldn't play? So what happens to this guy who thinks that, well, he only wants to pay somebody to negotiate a contract, but what about the issues or the problems that are going to develop from there on in? So this isn't a mandate that I take that's only for 5% of the time that we talked about earlier on. This is on the basis that any issue that surfaces, and if it's a football player, given their CBA, they can be cut. They can be cut based on medical issues alone. Contracts aren't guaranteed. That's a situation where you need a lawyer more than anything in a situation like that. So So I think this mandate that we have isn't only negotiating a contract, but it's there for everyday purposes. What happens if you're having a problem with the manager or the coach in terms of playing time? How do you solve that? So I think there are issues that occur on a daily basis and a continuous basis that you need a good agent or a good lawyer involved on your behalf in professional sport. And I would only say this to you, that if we weren't producing or we weren't solving all of these issues that come, and it's a very small world, they all talk with each other, then we wouldn't have the kind of practice that we have. You'd be in a practice that would be very short-lived. So when you make that sense of commitment and you sit down with a player and say, let's chart out a plan here. This is what we're going to do. We'll tell you exactly what we're going to do on your behalf. He has a pretty good understanding of that. And you're either following through with it and you're performing and you're there when he needs you, or you're not, in which case you won't have a very successful practice.
Hi. So in an old interview with ESPN, you said at one point during your career as a law student, you were given the opportunity to try out with the Montreal Alouettes. You responded saying you believe you made the right career choice. Furthermore, you had made drastic changes in career when you decided to become a sports agent instead of a partner in your first law firm. While you are incredibly successful in what you do, along the process before reaching this level of success, was there ever a time you regretted your choice of career or felt hesitant about the direction you were heading? If so, what helped you reach the clarity and reassurance to continue to move forward?
2 times specifically that I didn't think really I was going to make it or be successful. And one time related to going out on my own. And it meant really that I had no guarantee of any salary. And I was operating on a line of credit from the bank in those days when I started of $25,000. And I became an expert in dodging the bank on receivables. And I told them that they were coming. And fortunately, I had a pretty good bank manager who at least could see what I had, and I had some promise. But the receivables weren't flowing in as quickly as they thought they should. So there were times, really, I didn't have any independent money to substantiate a business. And for the first, I think, 6, 7 years of my practice within this industry, I paid my secretary more than what I made. And that was fine because I was building a business, and whatever I had, I was putting back into the business. So there were times, really, that I think dealing with a bank was problematic in incorporating my own company. And secondly, when you're new on the block and you're representing yourself to potential clients and you're conveying to them, well, here are my professional credentials, and here's all the enthusiasm I have, and here's my personality, but they might ultimately say, fine, what's your experience? And I think there were so many times where people said no, that I think 3 or 4 times I thought, I'm not going to make it. I better move on to something else. So, yeah, very much so. Very much so. And I can remember one time having made the decision, well, you know, I'm not going to make it, so I'm going to move on and do something else. I'm just going to go back and practice law with a large law firm. And I remember having a talk with my father, and he said, look, you've come this far. Hang tough. Stick with it. So, yeah, it wasn't easy. It's not something, if you said to me I'd have to do that all over again at my age, there'd be no chance.
How do you manage relationships with clients on subject matters outside of business?
Well, there are a variety of issues. They get into trouble. There's criminal issues. There are issues in relation to their families, financial issues. There are personal relationship issues. There are issues relating to prenup agreements. Those are sensitive discussions where you might bring your fiance to our office and say, by the way, Jennifer, Donnie wants to talk to you about a prenup agreement. So suddenly it's my idea. So there are all those kinds of issues that surface on a daily basis. There are issues in relation to investment issues. So I think on any given day, we have issues that are probably outside the realm of what we do on a conventional basis. There are issues in terms of teams. In other words, I'm being maligned by certain guys on the team, and it's troubling me. I can't focus and I can't play right. How do I overcome that? How do I deal with that? The coach is embarrassing me in front of everybody. I'm sensitive. I can perform, but how do I deal with that? They're just everyday people. I was taught when I first came into this business that a lawyer that I knew years ago said to me, now you have to understand, all of these athletes, although they're very skilled, they're human, and they're not all noble creatures. So operate on that basis. And they have problems, everyday problems like everybody else. But your point was, will they reach out to you because you are trusted? And in many respects, when we first act for people at the age of 16 or 17, before they sign, they get an indication of what we're like. They get an indication of our judgment values, the way we deal with issues, the way we deal with problems. So when they become a professional, when they're signing, they have a trust factor built in. And then really, a player has that kind of trust. He can come to you and say, how do I handle this? I'm making $9 million a year, and I've met somebody and I think I want to marry her, but how do I protect all my assets? So they'll trust you to have those kind of discussions. Or how do I manage a relationship with my father? He wants to be on salary. How do I deal with that? Should I be doing that? What do I do with my wife who says now her father should be on salary? So that's outside kind of the scope of what we do, what you would read about, what we'd be involved in. But we're involved in all those issues. So when I go into the office every day, I have no idea what's coming at me. That's what makes the day so challenging.
My question is, have you ever had a situation where a player's career is winding down, but he or she hasn't come to that acceptance that career is over, and how do you help them transition to that understanding?
You know, that's a very difficult situation because players who are competitive, athletes who are competitive, in large measure think they can go on forever. And it's very difficult to say to a player, it's time. It's time for a variety of reasons. There are numerous reasons that you might bring to the table. In most cases, they know in their heart that it's time, but they still keep hoping that maybe I can squeeze out another year. And those are decisions where you can, when you've built that kind of confidence over a number of years, that you can sit down and have that discussion face to face, just with the player, and you allow him to understand a little bit more maybe why it's in his best interest to say maybe it is time. And you have to be in a position to tell them the way it is. And they don't really want to hear that, but they know in their heart probably you're right, but they need somebody to kind of massage it and tell them in a gentle way. But that happens all the time. It happens all the time. There are some players, like Nicholas Lidstrom, played 20 years in the National Hockey League. He won his first Norris Trophy, being the best defenseman in the world at the age of 32, and then won 7 of them. Should have won more, actually. But Nicholas, at 20, his manager of the team used to say, I sleep better at night knowing Nicholas Lidstrom's playing on my defense. But Nicholas called him one day and said, it's time. And Kenny Holland said to him, why do you say it's time? And he said, because I can't compete at the level that I want to. I can't be as effective as I want to. And knowing that means that it's really not within my spirit or my heart to compete on that basis, and less than what I should be.
Donnie, you're the best. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you.